Let's next discuss the pedagogy and practice. These are the do's and don'ts. And in our participants workbook, there will be a list of these for you to make reference to. So we want to think about when incorporating Asian American history, perspectives, stories, and voices, it's important for educators to do so in accurate, diversifying, and humanizing ways. Now, this is a following list of some of the pedagogy in practice principles for teachers to apply to their planning and inclusion of Asian American history, allowing students to recognize Asian Americans as part of the larger American society then and today. One of the first principles is to go beyond cultural contribution approach when teaching the Asian American experience. So while we may showcase food, flags, fashion, folklore, festivals, and holidays that highlight discrete cultural elements of Asian ethnic groups and provides a window to their cultures, it does very little to increase students' knowledge and understanding of the historical and current experiences of Asian Americans living in the United States. Make sure you use classroom time to intentionally include Asian American historical and contemporary experiences and events. So as I mentioned, I am a 1.75 generation Filipino American, and one of our most popular traditional foods is lumpia. Lumpia is a Filipino egg roll, and I can eat a lot of this lumpia. I may also be willing to try on a sari, which is a colorful outer garment, not a costume, that is worn by many Indian women. And I also am curious about the different ways that Lunar New Year, not Chinese New Year, or Eid, the end of a month-long daytime fast, is celebrated in many East and Southeast Asian communities. However, eating lumpia will not teach me about the Rescission Act of 1946, where the United States stripped of their promised armed services benefits from Filipino soldiers who fought for the U.S. during World War II. Remember, the Philippines was a U.S. territory, and Filipino, Filipino X were considered U.S. nationals. Of the 66 countries allied with the United States during that time, only the Filipinos were denied benefits. And it was because of the persistent efforts by Filipino veterans that in 2009, they were eligible for a one-time $15,000 lump sum for the surviving veterans who are U.S. citizens and a $9,000 lump sum settlement for non-citizens. And trying on a sari will not help me understand how South Asian Americans have been targeted. For example, the dot busters in New Jersey post 9/11 anti-Arab Muslim attacks that was about attacking Asian Americans wearing turbans and hijabs, regardless of region and religion. And learning about Lunar New Year and Eid will not help me recognize how school calendars are based on a Gregorian Western calendar, where scheduling may conflict with many important cultural celebrations, putting a burden on some Asian American students when they're negotiating school and home life. So another principle is to also define terms. In addition to terms such as race, racism, and ethnicity, review key terms and phrases such as Asian American model minority, Oriental, perpetual foreigner, and yellow peril to fully understand the content being studied. Remember that the origins of the term Asian American in 1968 was an example of undoing the monolithic perspective of our group presented earlier in the session. Another principle is to provide the background on anti-Asian tropes. Dispel the problematic stereotypes of Asian Americans as the perpetual foreigner and yellow peril, as well as the model minority, which have deeply influenced how Asian Americans are regarded on an individual, institutional, and ideological level, and has negatively impacted Asian American students' racial and ethnic identity development. So referring back to our anti-Asian tropes presentation earlier, we can know a little bit more about what these myths are and how we should work at dispelling them. Additional principle is here to include, diversify, and humanize Asian Americans. Asian Americans have been largely excluded from the curriculum despite being part of the United States history as early as the 16th century. So consider the following. Ensure that Asian Americans are not essentialized and stereotyped as the model minority, perpetual foreigner, a threat, or simply one group rather than an inter-ethnic umbrella. Show Asian Americans as not only victims of nativist racism, but also those who are actively and intentionally challenging discrimination. Reflect the diversity of the multitude of ethnic groups' experience, not just default to East Asian American history. And broaden the Asian American experience to go beyond immigration issues to include other major themes such as school desegregation efforts, gender equality, labor rights, and multiracial movements. And finally, examine visual resources depicting Asian Americans, even in well-meaning ways, to ensure that they are void of stereotypes. When using visuals deliberately depicting Asian Americans in racist ways, such as propaganda posters or political cartoons, be sure that they serve as educational purpose and are analyzed for problematic content, and provide visual counter narratives to humanize Asian Americans. Another way to make sure that we are including, diversifying, and humanizing Asian Americans is to ensure that we are using books in an effective approach to Asian American inclusion. If it is to ensure that stories are providing a span that is a wide range of experiences over time, from the Chinese paper sons of the 19th century to recent refugees in Southeast Asia, to disrupt the perpetual foreigner idea. Complicate the immigration story that tends to be able to assimilate and achieve to recognize the diversity of migration stories. Share diversity within an ethnic group to avoid essentializing one ethnic group and stave off the danger of a single story, as explained by Chimamanda Adichie. And have been vetted or shared by Asian American students and their families who can provide perspectives on the accuracy and authenticity. So admittedly, this is a challenge that continues since there is a small number of children's books with an Asian American main character. And according to the Cooperative Children's Book Center at the School of Education at University of Wisconsin in Madison, in 2020, the number of Asian American centered books was 9.6% of the total number of children's books received. Another principle is to provide context when including Asian American history. Consider the past and current racial, economic, social, and political situations that influence how Asian Americans react, respond, and resist. Connect the experiences of Asian Americans to events that take place beyond our U.S. borders, such as U.S. imperialism and the emergence of a global economy, international war, and refugee needs. We might consider the question, for example, of how did the U.S. colonization of the Philippines or its war in Vietnam play a role in the migration of Filipinos and Vietnamese to the United States? Make sure that we are making Asian American history relevant. Not only connect Asian American events to a larger historical theme, but also to contemporary issues. For example, how can historical examples of Asian American resistance in the face of violence and injustice help students understand the importance of speaking out and being in solidarity with others and staying vigilant in protecting civil rights and civil liberties today? How can this understanding lead to students becoming actively involved in protecting their rights and dignity for all? So here we see that this advertisement for rat poison shows an image of a China man, maybe, and this is that sort of persistence of that yellow peril trope, and that may contribute to today's anti-Asian violence and animosity in response to the COVID pandemic. Also, be sure to avoid deficit language when talking about Asian American experiences. When discussing Asian Americans' ethnic cultures, history, contributions, and experiences, avoid language that diminishes Asian Americans as less cultured or passive victims in their own histories. Avoid using dominant Western-informed American cultural norms as measures of how American or sophisticated Asian Americans are, and unpack the common meaning of American to reveal prejudices that result in such deficit perspectives. Asian Americans face racism in the midst of Black and white racial binary, and many responded and resisted racism in many different ways under varying circumstances that factor into their response. So, for example, the sense of safety and community support and immigrant status. And of course, ensure the safety of our students. We want to guide students safely in and out of these discussions, particularly when violence and injustice targeting Asian Americans are discussed. Avoid publicly asking Asian American students to represent the entire Asian American community, as it is not a monolith, or to explain historical events to people. So always be mindful of the social and emotional needs of our students. And remember that safety is not just for Asian American students. When teaching about and including the Asian American experience, consider what kind of overt and hidden messages all students, regardless of their ethnic or racial background, may receive, and how they will use those messages to humanize or dehumanize Asian Americans as individuals and as a group, and how their expressed attitudes, actions, words, behaviors will be received by anyone, not just Asian Americans. So now, during this workshop here, as we are all in Zoom, I'd love for you to use the annotate feature in our Zoom call. And let's take a look at maybe placing a star on a principle that you feel that you are currently doing. So the feature here, for example, is to, I want to be able to go beyond the cultural contribution approach. And then let's put a check mark next to a principle that you would like to explore further. So let's use a check mark. And again, using the annotated feature in the Zoom. And maybe I want to make sure that I am including a more diverse material and leading lessons that are inclusive and are humanizing of Asian Americans. And again, this is the Pedagogy and Practice Principles, and these are the do's and don'ts discussed. Thank you.